We recently finished covering the first volume of the Suikoden I novelisation, which covered up to Tyr inheriting the leadership of the Liberation Army. Now we're starting the second volume of the novelisation, which begins 3 months later. This is a very slow chapter and not a whole lot of anything happens. There's a new scene with Tyr and Gremio, as well as Tyr, Gremio and Victor. Kirkis' introduction and their meeting is slightly expanded on, but in truth you can skip this chapter and not miss anything, as the entire chapter is summed up with Tyr meets Kirkis. And as always, I'll be doing no editing on these videos covering the novels. If a picture appears in the book, I'll put it up on screen while talking about that scene, but aside from that, treat these videos on the novels as an audio experience. Chapter 10. To the Great Forest. A morning mist covered the entire surface of Lake Torin. Tyr was up and out of bed before the sun had even risen. He opened his window, captivated by the sight below. As the sun rose above the mountain range in the east, he leaned out the window and turned his gaze to the sky of the distant north, where his father Tio was currently deployed. He gave a weary sigh and heard Gremio's gentle voice across the room saying good morning. Tyr turned to see Gremio standing by the door wearing an apron. Gremio smiled and said he's already prepared breakfast and asked Tyr if he'd like to go to the dining room. Tyr quickly got dressed and asked Gremio what's for breakfast. Gremio beamed as he told Tyr Yamko caught some amazing fish this morning and he made bouillabaisse using a recipe he received from Antonio. He said it's not a taste that can be described with words and one bite will make all of his troubles float away. Tyr followed Gremio out of his room and the two made their way to the dining hall. Then there's 3 lengthy paragraphs describing the castle and name-dropping the new recruits like Gaspar and Joppo. When the two of them reached the dining hall, Gremio shouted in surprise and ran inside asking Victor what he's doing. Tyr peeked inside and saw Victor sitting alone at the table in the middle of the dining hall, gulping down the bouillabaisse stew straight out of the pot. In a rage of annoyance, Gremio asked Victor when did he get up and why did he move the entire pot to the table. Unfazed, Victor said it tastes so good he wanted it all to himself. Gremio said he's happy to hear that, but he wanted the young master to be the first one to taste it. Feeling guilty, Victor turned to Tyr and said they should eat together. He invited Tyr over and made a soup pun by calling it super delicious and jokingly said with Gremio's cooking on their side, they'll kick the Imperial soldiers' asses. Tyr told Gremio the stew tastes wonderful and Gremio's face shone like the sun. He told Tyr to eat as much as his heart desires as he excitedly brought a basket of bread from further back in the dining hall. The dining hall soon began to fill up as more of their companions woke up. Victor had his fill and leaned against the wall in satisfaction. He then asked Tyr if he's heard anything about what the Empire has been up to recently. Tyr replied he hasn't heard anything from Matthew. Victor scowled and folded his arms as he told Tyr he's heard word from their scattered comrades regrouping at the castle that the Empire has been getting up to something in the Great Forest. Then there's a few paragraphs describing the Great Forest region and how it's inhabited by 4 races: elves, dwarves, kobolds and humans. The 4 races had been at war for a long time until the 6 wise men of the forest brokered peace between them in the solar year 80. The 4 races signed a peace agreement known as the Great Contract, and then the Forest of Illusion was created to protect the region from outside interference. The Scarlet Moon Empire inherited the agreement when the nation was formed. Victor told Tyr that he'd heard Quanda Rossman broke that peace and begun oppressing the people of the Great Forest about 3 months ago. Tyr knew Quanda. All of the 5 Imperial generals were friends, and Quanda had often visited his father Tio. He had memories of Quanda chatting with them, laughing heartily and drinking with his father. Quanda once caught Tyr gazing at the scar he could see under his armour, and he told Tyr the scar was from an arrow he took protecting his majesty. Tyr couldn't believe that Quanda would start a battle in the Great Forest, and he said to Victor that the Empire won't be able to make any big moves to suppress all the races thanks to the Great Contract. Victor said he'd normally agree, but his gut is telling him otherwise. He leaned over the table towards Tyr and said the Great Forest is going to go up in flames soon and he needs to speak to Matthew about what they're going to do about it. Tyr said he understands. As he rose from his chair, Gremio asked him if he's finished his breakfast. Gremio's ever-present smile made Tyr want to confide in him, and Tyr asked him if he has a minute. Gremio's expression grew worried and the two took a walk out to the harbour. Tyr walked without saying a word. his heart filled with a deep unease, much like he had felt this morning as he gazed out his bedroom window. The morning mist had already cleared and the sun was glittering on the surface of the lake by the time they reached the harbour. The harbour was constructed in the bay, big enough for 50 small boats to weigh anchor. Wooden docks stretched out towards the lake on either side of the stone wharf. The fishermen Taiho and Yamko bobbed beyond the docks in their boat. Even gazing at the glittering waves with the refreshing breeze coming off the lake failed to lift Tir's spirits. It was just too great of a difference in power between the Liberation Army and the Imperial Army. To roughly compare their numbers, Kwanda Rossman commanded 9,000 men at Pano Yakuta Castle in the Great Forest. Milik Oppenheimer commanded a further 9,000 in the Kunan region. His father Tio's unit in the north was 14,000 strong. In addition, Kasim Hazil's unit was located in the Senan region to the north of Lake Torin. The floating fortress of Shazarazade held Sonya Shulin's navy, and the Emperor had an army 20,000 strong on constant standby under his direct control in Gregminster. The Liberation Army hadn't even amassed half the power that the Imperial Army had at its disposal. If Victor was right, they were going to have to fight in the Great Forest on their own, which could spark all-out war with the Empire. Tir finally began to speak. He asked Gremio if he really believes they can oppose the Imperial Army. Gremio responded, "Their forces may be small now, but the Liberation Army continues to grow, and there are many people in every town who are dissatisfied with the Empire." He then said he doesn't know if they can match the entire Imperial Army, but they can certainly win a battle or two. Gremio continued and told Tir it's okay to struggle and it's okay to worry, as doing so is proof that you're moving forward and not running away from the difficult things in life. Tir thanked Gremio for his words, which eased his worries and made his heart feel lighter. Just then they heard a splish. Although it was quiet, they could hear it even on the other side of the dock, and then they heard a second splish. Tir asked what was that, and the two of them spotted what appeared to be a hand coming out of the water and grabbing the edge of the dock. Tir said they should go check it out and began running. When they looked into the water, they spotted the limp body of a man in green clothes bobbing lifelessly in the lake. This part is the same as the game. Gremio commented he's an elf and wondered if he swam all the way here. They helped him out of the water and carried him into the castle to receive aid. Gremio called for Cleo, who came running to treat him. As word spread around the castle, Matthew, Pon and Victor came running. The elf woke up. Matthew welcomed him to the Liberation Army's headquarters and asked him who he is. The elf sat up and began begging and pleading with them to help him, as Kwanda Rossman is planning to wipe out the elves. Tir was astonished that Kwanda would attack the people of the Great Forest. Tir then calmed the elf, who introduced himself as Kirkis. Kirkis told them his story in more detail. It had all started with small skirmishes, but a few weeks ago Kwanda Rossman had begun oppressing each tribe in earnest. The dwarves had moved their troops and were presently safe deep in the mountains. But as the elves' village lay close to Pano Yakuta Castle and the kobolds lived near the Forest of Morin, they seemed to be facing imminent ruin at the hands of a large force of Imperial soldiers. Everyone grew quiet as they listened to Kirkis's tale. They knew the Liberation Army didn't have enough strength in its current state to fight the Imperial Army. Matthew quietly asked Tir what he wants to do. Tir responded, humans and elves suffer the Empire's misgovernment just the same, and they've gathered to fight that injustice, so they cannot afford to ignore the mistreatment of any race. Kirkis thanked Tir, but Pon voiced his doubts and commented that elves hate humans. Ashamed, Kirkis looked down and told Pon he's right. He knows what he's asking is selfish, but they're his only hope. A single tear dripped onto Kirkis's fist, displaying none of that haughty elven pride that Pon had so disparaged. Tir admonished Pon and told him to stop, telling him they cannot and will not abandon the elves, no matter what reason he gives. Matthew said the Liberation Army's strength is that they carry the hope of the people on their shoulders, and they cannot betray the people. Cleo agreed, but reminded everyone that the Liberation Army is still too weak to fight Kwanda Rossman's forces head-on, so they need to come up with a better plan. She suggested sending a messenger to the Great Forest to persuade the elves, kobold and dwarves to join them while they prepare their forces for battle. Kirkis shouted out he'll do it, as their elders refused to ask the other races for help, no matter how dangerous their situation gets. Matthew thanked Kirkis, then turned to face Tir. He suggested Tir accompany him as an expression of good faith. Kirkis raised his head and looked at Tir. The zeal Tir saw burning in Kirkis's eyes strengthened his resolve, and Tir agreed to Matthew's suggestion. The matter was settled. That night, all soldiers gathered in the castle to begin preparations for war. As Tir and the others were preparing to disembark at the harbour, Matthew unexpectedly showed up to see them off. He said to Tir he'd like to have a word with him before he leaves. Tir asked him what's on his mind. Matthew's expression was meek. He told Tir that he's quite familiar with Quanda Rossman, that Quanda has a short temper, but he was never a man prone to senseless slaughter, and he can't imagine Quanda would ever do this. Memories of Quanda flashed through Tir's mind, and Tir responded he thinks the same. Matthew asked Tir, so you feel the same? He then told Tir that they should put all their effort into securing an alliance with the three races, and he'll join them once preparations are complete. Tir watched Matthew return to the castle until he faded from sight, then continued to prepare to depart. Tir, Kirkis, Gremio, Cleo and Victor all boarded the boat and travelled towards the Great Forest. And that's the end of chapter 10. Like I said at the beginning, it's not the most exciting of chapters. Tir meets Kirkis. This chapter begins the Great Forest arc, which will continue for 4 more chapters. In the next video I'll cover chapter 11, which covers Tir arriving in the Kobold village up to meeting Valyria and setting out to meet the dwarves. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.